Good afternoon. I did make some slides. Have those been uploaded? Yes? Excellent, excellent. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is an honor to be here with my good friend, Dr. Wallace. And I think the theme that I'm intended to speak about is how do we cultivate a culture of agency at a time when many of our young people are being given a steady menu of dependency. So as Dr. Wallace mentioned, I am at a think tank called American Enterprise Institute. I spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about how to create exceptional educational opportunities for the rising generation. So I study upward mobility, the factors that drive upward mobility, family formation, religion, adoption, education. But there's another part of my identity which is, I think, actually far more significant. And as the last speaker just talked about, it's about putting ideas into action. It's time to take action, to demonstrate that the values and beliefs that we stand for actually work in the real world. So I put my ideas into action on the ground, putting ideas into practice where it really matters in the very communities that we're seeking to uplift. And so since 2010, I've been CEO of public charter schools in New York City. The first 10 years running a network of all boys and all girls elementary and middle schools in the heart of the South Bronx and the Lower East Side of Manhattan. Our faculty educated more than 2,000 students across 6 campuses, primarily low-income, Black, and Hispanic students, with each year having an excruciatingly long wait list of nearly 5,000 families. And while our schools sent nearly 100% of our middle school graduates to top high schools and on to college, the reality for other kids was that in places like District 12 in the Bronx, only 7% of traditional district public school students who started 9th grade 4 years later graduated from high school ready for college. So just think about that for a moment. 7%. So there are about 2,000 students in District 12 that start 9th grade 4 years later. Either they had dropped out or they did earn their high school diploma but still could not do math nor reading without remediation if they were to finish their degree, right? Which is worse, that you drop out or you do what you're actually supposed to do, you finish the program over 4 years, and yet you still cannot read and write to compete on equal footing. So in 2020, after 10 years of running elementary and middle schools, I endeavored to open a new network of public charter high schools in that same district in which only 7% of students who started 9th grade 4 years later graduated ready for college. So I'm proud to say I bring greetings from Vertex Partnership Academies. These are some of our students. It is a virtues-based, and we'll talk about what I mean by that. It's a virtues-based international baccalaureate public charter high school that I founded and opened in the Bronx in 2022. And we'll speak about the school later, but I know how challenging it is to build enduring institutions that educate our young people, but it can be done. And the thing that we all have to think about is how do we take the ideas that we talk about here and actually convert those into institutions that we build in local communities. We are the ones that we've been waiting for, right? Now, the reason and actually, can I just real quick, because I clicked to I don't have the clicker. Next slide. I just always think it's important to pay homage to my parents. These are my parents, Vincent and Eula. My parents were married for 48 years. Before my dad passed away. Everything that I have been able to do is a function of the love and support that my parents gave to me. This was them on their wedding day in London in 1957. Beautiful story. They came to the United States in 1968, a particularly tumultuous year, right? Particularly as it relates to race relations. But they weren't running away from Jamaica or running away from England. They were running to the United States. They were running to this country because they believed that there was opportunity here. We had to be prepared for it, to take advantage of it, to capitalize on it, but the opportunities existed. And this was in, they recognized the country was changing. The Civil Rights Act had just passed. And so I run schools. You can, next slide. So that's me. That's me, with, you like the shirt, right? I think that's now a set of curtains in my in my living room. But this kid believes then what I believe now, that we live in a country with promise. And most importantly, I lived with my two parents who believed in education. They had a strong faith commitment, and they told me that anything was possible as long as I was prepared for it. And so we want to create that same kind of opportunity for the students that are in my school for what my parents believed for me. So the reason I run schools is I want our students in the Bronx to know that they can do hard things. I want our community to see with their own eyes what is possible. Even in the face of inevitable challenges, they can lead virtuous, self-determined lives of meaning and purpose. Now, we unfortunately gather today amidst increasing evidence that young Americans, especially Black Americans, nationwide see the promise of our nation slipping out of reach. This past March, the Wall Street Journal released a study revealing that young adults are more disillusioned and pessimistic about the future of our country than any living generation before them. The journal conducted a poll in February finding that more than 3/4 of voters, 18 to 29 years old, think the country is moving in the wrong direction, a greater share than any other age group. More young people now say they find it hard to have hope for the world than at any time since at least 1976. So at a time when belief in the American dream among young people seems to be in rapid free fall, the moral imperative that we have at this gathering is even more urgent. We have the responsibility to offer the optimistic view and truth that the American dream is real and it persists, even while acknowledging that it is not always fairly or evenly distributed. So towards this end, in 2014, Harvard economist Raj Chetty and his team of researchers conducted a study entitled, "Where is the Land of Opportunity?" They researched the income records for more than 40 million children and their parents. So think about this. Every child in America that was born between 1980 and 1982, they were able to get the anonymized tax records for every child in this country. So 40 million tax records. They then were able to take a look at those kids that were born in the lowest economic quintile in 1980 to 82, and then 30 years later, they were able to look at those same exact kids, now adults, 30 years old, and which of them was actually now in the top economic quintile, right? So you were born in the lowest economic, the lowest 20%, and 30 years later, you're now earning in the top 20%, a euphemism for achieving the American dream. And then Chetty and his team dissected the factors of what were the factors that drove whether or not someone could be born in the poorest and 30 years later be in the highest economic category. And if you go to I think a couple slides, so next slide, next one, next one, next one, this one. Anyone ever see this map before? Okay, so this map is known as the geography of upward mobility in the United States. So what Chetty and his team did was they broke up the country into what they call 741 commuting zones, where they did the analysis. They said This map shows the probability of being born in the lowest economic quintile and 30 years later earning in the top economic quintile. The lighter the color, the greater probability that you can achieve that American dream. The darker the color, your chances are actually very low, or even worse, that you would actually go even worse than the conditions under which you were born, right? So what are some of the things you notice immediately about this map? Definitely the South, but even more importantly, you recognize the variability, right? I mean, one would think, we're all governed by the same federal policies, the same national government, but clearly, whatever's happening at the national level, what matters more is what is happening locally. Whatever is happening locally overpowers whatever national interventions we're trying to create for economic mobility. But clearly in the South and different parts of the country, you have deep red. You also have very light, right? So Chetty and his team, Salt Lake City is the area of the highest economic mobility, and yet places like Atlanta and Milwaukee have the worst economic mobility. Why? Why? What are the factors that are driving being born in certain areas to put you on a path to economic prosperity, and or otherwise being in a community where it's very likely that you will remain poor or even worse? Why? Why? The Chetty study actually said, quote, the United States is a, quote, a collection of societies, some of which are lands of opportunity with high rates of mobility across generations, and others that experience persistent inequality, places in which few children escape poverty, end quote. A collection of societies, some of which are lands of opportunity, and others that experience persistent inequality. Why? Why? This has become the animating question of my life, to understand why. What are the factors, and how can we avoid the factors that determine those areas of persistent inequality, and replicate those areas that have the greatest prosperity? That is the animating question of my life. If we could understand those factors, particularly in those lands of opportunity, maybe we can then replicate those. So Chetty and his team, they broke it down. Because what's interesting is that even though we say the South, if you drill down into some of those communities that are deep red, there are some of those communities that are just as light as in other areas, right? So it's very interesting. So even though there's variability, even in those areas where it seems that you're doomed to live in one of these persistent poverty locations, there are those locations within those that are succeeding. And this was the key insight that Chetty and his team provided. They identified 3 characteristics of those communities that are lands of opportunity. First, quote, the strongest predictors of upward mobility are measures of family structure, such as the fraction of single parents in that area, end quote. So marriage. If you look at a community, in any of these areas, the rate of married 2-parent households in a community is directly linked to the level of upward mobility within that community, even if an individual child lives in a single-parent home. And it's always important to say this. Just because a child lives in a single-parent home, that doesn't mean that that child is doomed to failure, nor does it mean that a child who's born into a married 2-parent household is guaranteed success in their life. Right? We all know exceptions, so we have to acknowledge that, but the data is overwhelming, that the conditions that are much more likely for a child to be successful exist in a married 2-parent household. And what Chetty's research says is, if that's the community norm, the entire community has a much greater likelihood of upward mobility. So that's the first big indicator that he found. Second, quote, high upward mobility areas tend to have higher fractions of religious individuals and greater participation in local civic organizations, end quote. So religion matters, social capital matters. Again, if you've got vibrant community-based organizations, particularly faith-based organizations, in a community, that correlated to upward mobility. Third, quote, proxies for the quality of the K-12 school system are also correlated with mobility. So as the gentleman just spoke about, school choice, having access to vouchers, education savings account, the mechanisms by which access to high quality schools is another third element of upward mobility, right? These things almost seem obvious, right? Family structure, presence of married two-parent households, high concentrations of religious individuals, and access to high quality schools. Duh, right? Right? But that's not where our conversation we need reparations. We need all these interventions which presume these artificial interventions or policies or practices that have nothing to do with what the evidence tells us is what drives economic mobility in communities. And the truth is, it is no coincidence that these high rates of family stability, exemplified by married two-parent households, concentrations of religious individuals, and access to high-quality K-12 education are strongly correlated to upward mobility at the neighborhood level. So in my own work for 30 years, I've worked with every imaginable kind of kid. I've worked with rich kids, poor kids, black kids, white kids, Hispanic kids, Asian kids, kids from intact families, kids from completely unstable families, foster care, homeless kids, kids experiencing domestic violence, privileged kids. And what I have observed over these last 30 years, because I've now been in this work long enough where I've seen young people, in their teen years start making decisions as they enter young adulthood, right? And I've seen kids from horrific conditions where they face poverty, violence, abandonment, neglect. And as they make their decisions to enter young adulthood, sometimes they recreate the same conditions that they lived under, perpetuating the cycle of deprivation and degradation in their own lives, right? But I've also seen young people in those same exact conditions make different sets of decisions, allowing them to break the cycle of disadvantage, right? To put them on a very different trajectory for their future. So again, the question is, what makes the difference? What is it that those young people who were able to break the cycle of disadvantage, what is it that they were exposed to that allowed them to chart a very different path for their own future? And that is the question that I'm trying to answer in our schools and I advocate for. My observation is that students that have been able to break the cycle of disadvantage as they enter their passage into young adulthood is that they typically had a sense of personal agency, a belief that they could lead a self-determined life of meaning and purpose. But the sense of agency didn't come from nowhere. It's not as if they just pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. In my observations over 30 years, young people able to break the cycle of disadvantage usually interacted with what I consider are the 4 key pillars of human flourishing. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah. Family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. It's the framework I call F.R.E.E. So let's start with the most important, family. And actually, can you go one more slide forward? So this is a fascinating chart. So at our school, we run a high school in the Bronx. So we have this concept of what we call the deciding decade, age 14 to 24. Because the period from age 14 to 24 is when young people, on the passage to young adulthood, are making the kinds of decisions that will have huge influence over the rest of your life. Decisions you make about how much time am I spent studying, your education, the relationships that you have, family formation, religious faith, how you work, all of those decisions during that period of time, age 14 to 24, huge influences. So we want to ensure young people are equipped to make good decisions during this period. And one of the most important decisions is around relationships and family formation. So this chart represents from 1990 to 2022. The blue line represents one of the greatest public health achievements in our country, which is the lowering of the teen birth rate, teen pregnancy rate, from 1990 to 2022. And you can see kids age 15 to 19, we made incredible progress in helping young people understand that getting pregnant or having children from age 15 to 19 was not the right thing to do there for life. Look at that. That is an extraordinary public health achievement from the blue line going down, right? The blue line represents ages 15 to 19 kids, the teen birth rate. But at that same time frame, from 1990 to 2022, the red line represents the non-marital birth rate for young women ages 20 to 24. And so you can see that in 1990, the non-marital birth rate was still relatively high, but about 35%, is now close to 70% amongst women 20 to 24. So what does that tell you? That means we were really good at getting young people to know that they shouldn't have kids in ages 15 to 19, but as soon as they entered young adulthood, they're having sex and they're having kids outside of marriage. And then there's other data which is regarding something called multiple partner fertility, which represents multiple children also, because about 30% of those young women in the red line are having at least their second child before age 24. Okay? This has huge implications on the quality of life for our young people and the communities in which we live. So the first element of F.R.E.E. is family. We have to help young people think differently. It doesn't matter about the family that you're from. It's all about that you are about the family that you're on the pathway to form. Okay? So that's why in our school, we teach something called the success sequence. Can you go one slide forward? Okay. This is an actual ad that was running in New York City that promotes something called the success sequence. The success sequence says if you are a young person and you finish at least a high school degree, then get a full-time job of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and then if you have children, marriage first, that series of decisions, education, work, marriage, then children, 98% of the time, data shows that you will avoid poverty. And the vast majority enter the middle class or beyond. Now, it's not 100%, it's not a guarantee, right? But how do we help our young people think about how to create the conditions within their own lives for which is much more likely they will be successful economically and almost in any other dimension? So we actually have a class in our high school called Pathways to Power, in which we teach this data. We teach kids that you're going to be, during what we call the deciding decade, age 14 to 24, you're going to be making big decisions about education, work, your faith, relationships. We want you to know the likely rewards or consequences associated with different series of life decisions. So that's family. It's not about the family that you're from, it's about the family that you're on the path to form. That's one of the first anchors we want our young people to know about. And again, we run a high school, there's all focus on history, math, science, very important, but these are the life lessons about how you ultimately lead a self-determined life of meaning and purpose. The second pillar of F.R.E.E. is religion. The young people that I have observed over my 30 years working with kids of every kind is that those young people able to break the cycle of disadvantage typically lived by a moral code, often informed by a personal faith commitment. Christianity, Buddhism, Judaism, Catholicism, it almost didn't matter which religion or which moral code, but that there was one, right? That they had a sense of right versus wrong. So that when they faced inevitable challenges where they've got to grapple with different issues, they had some foundation to rely upon to help make those decisions. And more importantly, they were part of a community of people who were part of rituals, could be going to church on Sunday, but a part of a community of people that expected them to live by the moral code, right? So we talk to our students about the value of having a religious and personal faith commitment in your own life. We can't dictate it, but we want young people to know that this can be a huge source of strength for you, and you can be part of a community of people that love you. Okay, the third pillar of F.R.E.E. is education, the first E in F.R.E.E. Young people able to break the cycle of disadvantage usually benefited from some kind of education freedom and school choice. I run public charter schools in an area where, again, only 7% of kids are graduating from high school ready for college, and yet, New York City, there's a cap on charter schools. There is a barrier. If you had an idea to open a great school for those kids, you couldn't do it. Same thing in Chicago. I saw Pastor Brooks last night was telling me that charter schools are, in the crosshairs of the teachers union, right? And so we have to fight for school choice. We have to fight for parents to have the ability, whether it's vouchers, education savings accounts, charter schools. We need to put the power of choice in the hands of low-income parents. Because guess what? Middle and upper-class parents exercise choice every day, right? They are moving to the suburbs. They're sending to their kids to private school. They're exercising choice every day, and yet the children who are most vulnerable don't have access to the same high-quality choices. So that's the third pillar of F.R.E.E. And then the last pillar of F.R.E.E. is entrepreneurship. And the thing is, if you are on the path to form a strong family, if you are live by a moral code, typically informed by strong religion, if you've benefited from educational choice, then you usually have developed what I call an entrepreneurial spirit. You have a work ethic. You're a problem solver. You don't succumb in the face of challenges, right? You have an overcomer's mindset. That is what we are seeking to build in our students. And just to give you a practical way in which we think about how we manifest this in the real world, in the junior and senior year of our school, so again, we're a high school, it's an international baccalaureate high school, we have this idea that college doesn't have to be the only immediate option after high school. So at the end of sophomore year, our students choose something called the International Baccalaureate Diploma Pathway, or what we call the Careers Pathway. And both are college prep, both are very rigorous, but in the Careers Pathway, you have the opportunity to do apprenticeships in particular industries, right? So you could study phlebotomy at Northwell Hospital, or computer science at Microsoft. So when you graduate from high school, you can have an industry credential with labor market value. You will have done an apprenticeship for 2 years while in high school, learning those elements of how you build a work ethic, right? So there are many ways in which we can actualize these ideas, and we can talk more about how we do it at our school. F.R.E.E. is my empowering alternative to inspire a rising generation to maximize their potential, to promote empowering messages of hope and agency versus grievance and dependency. Now, I want to close with this. In addition to academic rigor, we also have a very deliberate approach to moral formation. Next slide. That's our mission statement. Next slide. Okay. So our school is organized around the 4 cardinal virtues. Yep, this one. Of courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. These cardinal virtues, the word cardinal comes from the Latin root cardo, which means hinge. All other character-based strengths, resiliency, determination, perseverance, optimism, gratitude, all of those are somehow derivative of these 4: courage, justice, temperance, and wisdom. Each virtue is an intrinsic life habit that we are seeking to cultivate within each of our students. When normed and practiced regularly, these individual behaviors then form the collective basis of a good society, a community that is self-governed by public virtue. And so for each cardinal virtue, we require our students to memorize what we call I statements as part of their process to internalize their sense of personal agency. So I'm going to ask you to indulge me in citing out loud with me each one of these I statements, because this is what our students do every day in terms of, so please repeat me, please. Courage. I reject victimhood and boldly persevere even in times of uncertainty and struggle. Right? Think about that. I want you to think about a group of 14-year-olds in the Bronx in their beautiful blazers and ties saying, I reject victimhood and boldly persevere even in times of uncertainty and struggle. We want our kids to learn these, to memorize these words by heart here, in their head, but then ultimately in their heart in terms of how they practice their behavior every day. Temperance. I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and behavior. This is what our kids are absorbing every single day. I lead my life with self-discipline because I am responsible for my learning and behavior. So if ever anyone else comes to visit us in the Bronx and you ask a student, what does justice mean to you? They're going to say, I uphold our common humanity and honor the inherent dignity of each individual. If our students absorb these words, and most importantly, what these words mean, that as their foundation, we are unstoppable. Let me close. Well, I'll just show you one chart. Here, next slide. I always love this. Just read that for a second. One of these lions has security, free shelter, free food, free medical care. The other lion has none of those assurances, none. Everything about his quality of life is his own responsibility. We show this to our students. Which lion will you be? Which lion will you be? Okay. Do it. Do it. That's the deal. All right, very last slide. Let me close by sharing a quote, chapter 13 of de Tocqueville's America. He said, quote, "The greatness of America lies not in being more enlightened than any other nation, but rather in her ability to repair her faults," end quote. What that suggests for me, it resonates with the notion that America is always in pursuit of becoming a more perfect union. We have the tools of self-betterment and self-renewal built into our country in our founding documents. We want our students to know that they have within themselves the tools of self-betterment and self-renewal for how they can improve themselves and our country. And this picture just represents when we took 60 of our students to Washington, D.C. We've done it 3 times now and spent 2 hours in private discussion with Justice Thomas. And this was an amazing conversation because this was after the Supreme Court decision on nullifying race-based affirmative action. We had this amazing discussion. And at the end of the discussion, I asked our students, when it comes to college admissions and your race, do you think you should have an inherent advantage or inherent disadvantage when it comes to deciding whether or not you should get into college? And the resounding answer was neither. They just want to compete on equal footing. All right. Thank you very much.